Good evening. Today in Chess Comedy Books 34, I want to look at a publisher called Dover. In this country where they're not particularly active, they're called Constable. Well, maybe they are, but let's call them Dover because that's broadly speaking what they're referred to by us. Dover have over the years published many chess books, and currently I've just been studying their latest catalogue. There are about 45 chess books on it. Thanks to my friend Pete Tamburo on Skype one day a couple of years ago, I met Mr. Fred Wilson. Both of these gentlemen are from the US of A, you understand, and Fred Wilson was personally responsible for putting so many titles on the list into the catalogue of Dover, including books by Botvinnik, Lasker, Capablanca, you name it. Sinosko Borovsky, Botvinnik, books you'd never have seen otherwise. And I really do think we owe him a very great deal of thanks. I've selected 6 books here, Dover's, some of which are still in print, and you can look through them, rather look at them and then see if they're in print or it's the sort of thing you'd like. These aren't necessarily runaway bargains, but they are fairly good value, and a Dover reprint will last you, and it will last you. I've got books I've had since I was a boy, and they're still serviceable. The first of these I've shown before on these little chinwags, but there we are. It's called Kings of Chess. You may see one thing about Dover's is you may see them with slightly different covers depending on when and where they were published, because they've been printing them for years and years. The series is the actual imprint starting in the USA is about 80 years old. I've just looked it up, and they publish still coloring books and things about crafting, and they're very strong on things like horror or banned books or needlework, things like that. And chess now, as I say, doesn't loom as large as it perhaps it did 20, 30 and 40 years ago, but 45 titles on their books. I mean, how many of any publisher got, including, say, Batsford's? I don't know. Every man would have more than 45, wouldn't it? But I can't think of too many others that would. This is Kings of Chess by Willie Winter. I'm calling him Willie because his father was called William. So he took the diminutive form in his family gathering. Botvinnik, Lasker, Capablanca, Alekhine and Erva. It's quite a nice book. It's not something I've studied yet, but I will do. It's easy to think, because you've had a book for ages, that you know, if you haven't looked at it now, you never will. Well, that's a bit cynical, and I will be looking at it, but at the moment I haven't. Fairly light notes, but I'm sure they're good ones. William Winter was one of the first players in this country to be awarded the IM title, along with such as Golombek. He was a committed communist. Because of that, he perhaps didn't do anything for his popularity. This takes us up to the dawn of the Soviets, and here we have a very long chapter, good stuff too, I'm sure, about Botvinnik. So here he is playing Bronstein in 1951. I'm sure that by most standards you could say, well, this could do with an update. I don't know that it could. I mean, this, as I say, that takes us up to about 70 years ago. So it's pretty thorough. It doesn't go back. It's, as I say, it starts with Lasker. So it would start who was born and played as a young master in the 19th century, and takes us right up till after the Second World War. So it's a pretty good sweep and a nice relaxed history. Respected book. Now, this is a fairly recent title about Paul Morphy. I've read mixed reviews about this. I don't know what to think. This book about the best chess player of the 19th century analyzes Paul Morphy's games and positions in depth to reveal the essence of his style. It's the first collection in English of all 413 of Morphy's known games, including a 27-page essay on Morphy by Steinitz and a series of letters between Alexander Alekhine and Eugene Zanosko-Borowski debating Morphy's style. Now, I can only repeat, I don't really know what I think about this book, but I have had a good look through it. I always enjoy anything to do with Morphy. He was a great entertainer, and his games are very instructive. To my surprise, maybe your delight, though I don't know, it's in algebraic notation. Most Dover books, not all, are quite old, and they're not going to be in anything other than English descriptive. But this is. It deals with various themes, talking about Steinitz, and it needs to be compared with the Morphy book by Chris Ward, the English Grandmaster, former British champion, Chris Ward. It attempts, probably quite successfully, to set things down in context. And it looks at various openings, the Philidor counter gambit, so 3f5, various things which the King's Gambit, of course. Well, I'd miss it if he didn't. The Boden Kaiseritzky. And there's an enormous amount of games at the back, most of which I'm sure you would have on a database. And one or two pictures which you'll have seen before. But yes, it's quite scholarly. And something anyone who's researched Morphy's games is bound to be struck by the difficulties and slipshod nature of much of what has been reported. This rings a bell with me because recently Tim Harding's been writing similarly. And this is written by the late Dale Brandreth. I was in contact with Dale, and he sent me, out of kindness as much as anything else, because the first time he sent it to me, it got lost. And he sent me a second book, not this one, on Morphy, the book by Moroxy. Anyway, here we are. I don't think I'm the equal of pronouncing this guy's names. Shibut. Macon Shibut. I think he's still active as a player, and he clearly has presented a very new stance, shone a light on the life of the Creole. The chess, well, he was clearly, and one of the few players in the 19th century of whom it can be said he was truly of grandmaster's strength. He was head and shoulders above his contemporaries. This is rather more of a curio and has been out for about 40 years in this manifestation. The book has come in, as has so much and so much, for fairly heavy criticism. I quite like it. The games are grouped by opening and are in English descriptive notation. I like it. It's got lovely old diagrams. Blackburn was quite an old character. It doesn't cover all his career, but I think it takes that to about 1900. Blackburn died in about he did die in 1924. By then, he was a very old man. But for all of that, I'm trying to find the last dates. Here are his blindfold games all grouped together. Enormous amount of blindfold games, and I'm sure also games at odds, and a chapter explaining it all. It would be a long and difficult task to write a full and minute history of blindfold chess and its professors. In fact, there is a book, isn't there, by Knott about blindfold play, and also Eliot Hurst. I think they collaborated, and I was in contact with Hurst just briefly. I think he was one of these sort of tough guy people. Nothing wrong with that. So he tried to dissuade me from writing anything about me. Now stop right there, he wrote. Well, anyway, I didn't. And as a result of that, he came back to me and said, thank you for what you wrote. So, you have to stick to your guns, don't you? Yes, it has a bit of history, and it's quite flavoursome. And you aren't likely to be able to afford the original. This is a reprint. And it came out in 1979. So, yes, I'm right. About 40 years ago. I remember it when it first appeared. And it has an intro with some corrections by the late David Hooper. There it is. There's also a book by Owen Hindle on Blackburn when he was an old man. And there's a complete book on Blackburn by Tim Harding, but we can come on to that in a future date. Don't let anything I say dissuade you from wanting this book. If you want chess with a little bit more of a twist, a little bit more of old style, old world, this could be your man. Now, this book has puzzled me a bit without troubling me. It's about Tarrasch. Now, Tarrasch seems to be somewhat unlike Nimzovich or Alekhine, but particularly like Nimzovich. He seems elusive. I could spend the rest of my life studying these games. And the thing is, I don't think I could understand what he's talking about beyond explanation of what is actually in front of me at that moment. You could say, well, I shouldn't have played this move, or I did play this move, and subsequently I scored a number of victories with it over the next 5 years or something. I can understand that. Anyone could understand that. But I didn't find that this was what I needed. A very strong friend of mine, London League player, great approaching master strength, told me that this was a simplified form of some of the German books about Tarrasch, and was one of the best books in his entire chess life that he'd ever read. And he said to me that, this is real. This is really good stuff. You're mining gold. I can't see it. But because it's a Dover, I'm reviewing it here. It's by Fred Reinfeld. And that might have been why originally I used to turn my nose up at Fred. I don't know. But for all of that, he had access to a number of German sources that I'm not going to get. And Tarash did play for the World Championship, albeit incredibly unsuccessfully. And he was, of course, one of the strongest players in the world at the turn of the last century. There we are. For the right player, that could be really special. But for me, it's just an average chess book. Now, here we have a book which has never interested me at all. The fonts are very small, which doesn't help, does it, for an older player? But this is one of the books which I have been told by many people is really good. Now, whether they're saying they think Rubinstein was very good, or this by Hans Kmoch is a good book, you know what? I don't really know. The notes are not deep, but they are direct. They call a spade a shovel, in other words. And they are presented in chronological order. Rubinstein lived a long life. Some of it, I'm afraid to say, in care. This takes us up to 1931, when he played against Kashtan, who, after all, was a comparatively modern player. And as long as 1909, he's playing against Lasker. Yes. These days, Rubinstein is a very well covered player, very well documented. So we start in 1907. Well, he would have been playing before then, to say the least. So this is something, a little bit of a curio, but you may like it. It's a mild book. It's translated by Winckelmann and annotated by Hans Kmoch, who wrote Pawn Power, didn't he? So I wouldn't criticize it for lack of insight. But the fonts are pretty dire, and as I say, I think it's just a modest book. I would say it was a low average. Now we come to something slightly unusual in as much that the author, Reuben Fine, lived a long chess life, but he retired from the game when faced possibly with the rise of the Soviet school. He was one of the strongest players in the world, and he was nominated by FIDE on the death of Alekhine to play in a little tournament they had. Obviously in committee they decided, and he declined his place, and he was not replaced. So that's interesting, because they could have given the place to Bronstein or Najdorf or where you choose your player. Instead, they didn't. These notes are fairly light, and there is always the possibility of books in that era that the book wasn't written by Reuben Fine at all. It was written by Fred Reinfeld, but I'm not sure whether it was or whether it wasn't. I know that he did do some ghosting. That doesn't mean to say he ghosted everything. It doesn't mean to say that the whole book isn't by Dr. Fine. I simply don't know. I don't know this book very well, but I quite like it. It's very straightforward, and Fine was an important player. If you know a single Reuben Fine game, it's possibly the Blitz game, which Fischer contested against him in 1963. Well, there's a very great deal more to our Reuben Fine than that. These games go right back to before the war and between the wars. Here he is playing the Alekhine defense against Alekhine. How ironic. It is the dream of every young chess hopeful to begin his career with a victory against a world champion, he modestly writes. I was able to do that in a simultaneous exhibition against Capablanca in 1930 to 31. The game took, 2 years? No, it's a joke. Yes, here we are, playing Capablanca. And as an old man, he said if enough money could be raised, that he would play a match against Fischer. And he ran into quite a bit of stick for saying that. I'm just going to do my usual act of showing you the pages. There we are. That's pleasing enough, isn't it? They aren't cluttered. You can see what's happening. The openings are named and the tournament and everything. I meet the younger generation in his game against Kremer. Yes, that fits in with what I thought. This goes up to 1948. I have a much more detailed biography of Fine, which came out 10 years ago or so, and we can look at that at some future point, possibly. But for the moment, as I'm covering a publisher, I will say to you, I quite like this book. It's nothing trailblazing, but it's thorough, consistent, and has a number of good points about it. I would have liked some cross tables. I would have liked some photographs. But, Fine didn't write that much. He wrote the book on psychology, and he went into, he became a doctor. He did consulting, psychiatric analysis of patients, and he didn't stay in the chess world. And for that alone, I hope he benefited. We missed him, I'm sure, but the fact remains he was one hell of a player. Well, thank you very much. I've been James Pratt. Hope you've enjoyed this look. Chess comedy books. Good night.